This is why a higher VO2 max won't stop you from gassing out. It's pushed to be the answer to everyone's conditioning problems, likely because of the big push on the mainstream health influencer podcast. But you are undercooking your conditioning as a fighter if this is the metric that you're solely focusing on. Now, this is not YouTube best practices, but I'm gonna spend a lot of time looking at my screen because I have pages of notes to run through this with you. And as I get into this, check the first link in the description. The conditioning mentorship is the final week to sign up for cohort 3 with Dr. Andrew Usher. And there's the MMA and Jiu-Jitsu strength conditioning blueprints. They're completely free. That will run through everything you need for effective strength conditioning. So let's start. Let's define VO2 max, and that is the maximal oxygen consumption, or simply how much oxygen you can take in during exercise. Now, typically you'll have tacked on to the end of that how much oxygen you can consume and utilize. However, there's actually no way to see how oxygen is utilized unless you have another device. So it does not tell you how that oxygen is being used, it's just telling you how much you're consuming. And case in point here is if you look at this graph, where the mouse is on the screen, that is where VO2 peak occurred in this athlete on an incremental treadmill test. And from a quick look, you can see there's much more gas left in the tank after hitting maximum oxygen consumption. So while it is a marker of aerobic endurance, it doesn't tell us the whole story. Similar to how we can't tell much from jump height alone, since there are many strategies to get to the same jump height, and that could be squatting all the way down and jumping, or it could be a very fast and rapid short descent into a jump. That's already the first issue with VO2 max, but let's go through what I believe are the reasons this metric is pushed so hard on combat athletes. And by the end, you'll understand which approach is likely better for your conditioning. So let's start. The first one, endurance athlete training schedules. A typical elite endurance athlete will have a schedule of around 80% low intensity work, 20% higher intensity work. And since endurance athletes are quote unquote the fittest athletes on earth with the highest VO2 maxes, we've taken that model and we've applied it to many mixed sports. And by mixed sports, it's just sports that require multiple qualities. What's interesting is we don't actually do the same thing from strength sports. We take bits and pieces, but we don't take whole models. But I digress. There's plenty of issues with this. The first one is an endurance athlete's sport is running, cycling, rowing, swimming, skiing, whatever it is. So it makes sense to rack up volumes of those activities to improve efficiency and condition the body for long races. Secondly, most of the mitochondrial benefits are likely delivered from the high intensity sessions within that training plan. And there's a great paper that actually details a lot of this. I'll throw up on the screen here. And I've also got previous videos about that. The second one is around central adaptations or systemic adaptations. We're talking about at the heart level. And as an endurance athlete, you do want a large portion of your conditioning to go towards targeting the heart. Now again, nothing happens in isolation, but lower intensity typically skews the adaptations to the heart to be able to improve oxygen delivery. And if you look at this paper here by Levine in 2008, VO2 max is closely tied to oxygen delivery. So if you're able to improve the ability of the heart to pump blood and deliver oxygen, your VO2 max is likely to go up. And the more oxygen that is being delivered, the more oxygen that there is for the muscles to use. Now, as I mentioned, low intensity conditioning biases the adaptations towards the heart, so you're able to make that heart chamber bigger. In technical terms, that is left ventricular eccentric hypertrophy, just meaning that the chamber in the heart gets bigger, so it's able to pull more blood per heartbeat and then pump more blood per heartbeat. One unfortunate misunderstanding that's been pushed in the conditioning world is the idea that high intensity conditioning does the opposite by increasing the thickness of the heart wall, making the chamber smaller. But we know this is not the case, as evidenced by improved time to exhaustion, even after 9 weeks of maximal sprint training. You can just look at this graph here. And then further, high intensity interval training allows high stroke volumes and can elicit similar adaptations to the heart as low intensity conditioning. This brings me to the third and final point on VO2 max, and that is that it's a marker of aerobic endurance. It's often referred to as the ceiling, so if you raise the aerobic ceiling, you're quote unquote fitter since you have a bigger engine. Even though this sounds like it's only positive for you as a fighter, it is only part of the story regarding conditioning for combat sports. You can have athletes with VO2 maxes in the 40s outperform athletes with VO2 maxes in the 60s on an incremental treadmill test as an example. So what does this say about VO2 max as a measure of fitness? Now we can take this a step further and we can actually look at average VO2 max values within combat sports themselves. And unfortunately, they're not at endurance athlete level. For example, The VO2 max values of elite level amateur boxers typically ranges from 55 to about 62 milliliters per kg per minute. In jiu-jitsu, we pretty much have no data except very old data, which shows a very low VO2 max of around 45 milliliters per kg per minute, but again, it's not a professional sport. Elite junior Iranian freestyle wrestlers have VO2 maxes range from 50 to 57. Regional and amateur level USA MMA fighters have a VO2 max around 55 on average in the welterweight division, which seems to be on par with the averages seen in the UFC PI data. If we look at VO2 max data across sports with untrained or recreationally trained individuals, we see the bottom threshold being approximately 45 to 48 milliliters per kg per minute. These values are taken from two papers. A 1967 paper comparing VO2 max over 19 different sports in the Swedish national team, and a 2013 paper, which I really like, by Depot, I think, and colleagues, who classified 5 different performance levels by VO2 max. You can see the little graph here. The first level of under 50 milliliters per kg per minute was subject to participated in physical activity less than 2 to 3 hours a week. So as you can see, combat sport athletes fall into performance level 1 and 2, so they don't exactly have high VO2 maxes compared to other athletes. In elite endurance sports, we're looking at performance levels 4 and 5 in this graph, having a VO2 max greater than 70 with hours of training and slogging miles. This is also backed up by Hugh and colleagues in 2000, who looked at regionally and nationally ranked versus elite triathletes who had on average VO2 maxes above 70 milliliters per kg per minute. So overall, you can see combat athletes don't exactly have elite endurance athlete VO2 maxes. But let's break this down further. Here's why focusing on VO2 max as the primary conditioning outcome likely isn't the best use of your time. And it comes down to this idea of repeating high intensity efforts. We can label this anything, repeat power ability or power endurance. All of these, I would argue, fit within this idea of repeated high intensity efforts. And as an example, the UFC found that 77% of all UFC fights are ended within the 8 to 14 second high intensity work period with a 1 to 2 to 1 to 4 work to rest ratio. So the high intensity work period is where fights are ended most of the time. And we can look at the activity to rest ratio across all the combat sports. Elite boxers show an activity to break ratio of 18 to 1, meaning they perform 18 offensive and defensive actions before a break in action. Kickboxing requires 2 seconds of high intensity effort followed by 6 seconds of rest on average. We can look at successful versus non-successful fighters, where successful kickboxers use more offensive and defensive actions and punch combinations compared to losers. Successful boxers maintain a high frequency of attacking movements throughout each round, which highlights the importance of repeated high intensity efforts. Grappling's no different. We typically see a 6 to 1 effort to pause ratio. Judo, we see 2 to 1 to 3 to 1. Wrestling and judo are relatively similar with a 2.5 to 1, which is about 27 to 47 seconds of work to 7 to 20 seconds of rest. Now, this is just averages taken from the current research that we have, but it highlights the relatively intermittent nature of combat sports. But when we look at the intermittent nature of sports and what physiological principles underpin the performance of repeating efforts, we typically see research focusing on repeat sprint ability. And that's just because team sports require sprinting and it requires doing it often and is seen as a key performance indicator for successful team. Now, typically we see aerobic capacity, as measured by VO2 max, significantly largely correlate with repeated sprint ability, meaning the higher your VO2 max, the better you're able to repeat sprint efforts. But not all research agrees with this, with some papers only show moderate correlations between VO2 max and repeated sprint ability, likely because, as this one paper stated, subjects tended to save energy to counteract fatigue, as shown by the first sprint of each block being slower than their maximal sprint effort. And you'll find that often within team sports where you're doing some kind of repeated sprint exercise or some kind of hard conditioning, and athletes won't go all out on the very first few reps because they know they're going to last for the rest of the session. Whereas if you're doing proper sprint interval training, especially as a combat athlete, you need to blast yourself in that very first one for it to be maximally effective. But regardless, we move on. Combat sports are not a sport of sprinting. And by sprinting, I mean running over ground sprinting. And high intensity efforts often involve working against an opponent of similar weight when grappling or throwing, a flurry of strikes, mixed with clinching and bullying your opponent. This is where the term repeated high intensity effort was born and includes any effort, including sprinting, but like wrestling, scrambling, throwing, sweeping, and striking. Now, interestingly, the relationship between repeated sprint ability and repeated high intensity efforts is poor, showing the strenuous demands of non-running activities like wrestling. So a VO2 max correlates well with repeated sprint ability as an example, and repeated sprint ability does not correlate well with repeated high intensity efforts, we could assume that VO2 max likely does not correlate well with repeated high intensity efforts, which I'm going to show you a little bit now. So there's only been one study I think that's done this, and it's been in rugby league, where they use GPS to isolate and quantify collision demands from running. So essentially they ran through a repeated high intensity effort drill, and that was involved repeating sprints, but also tackling a bag. So you had that repeated high intensity element in there, not just the sprinting. They found a greater reduction in collision performance, so in tackling performance, than the speed, with a 14% difference. Basically saying that the wrestling or tackling or collision aspect of that drill declined much faster than the sprinting portion of that drill. And therefore, enhancing repeated high intensity efforts will take more than just developing the quote unquote aerobic engine from VO2 max. So is zone 2 training going to improve your ability to recover between high intensity efforts, between rounds, between matches? Especially when we've been told that aerobic processes drive the recovery between these efforts, which is completely true. But when people hear that the aerobic energy system helps improve recovery, they instantly go to low intensity steady state cardio to improve aerobic capacity, known as VO2 max, through central adaptations. So let's actually look what's happening at the muscular level. We need to look at a couple of great studies that have come out in the past few years by Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babrai in professional boxing. Now, make sure you check out the description because you need to get on the conditioning mentorship with Dr. Andrew Usher, because he shares everything on conditioning, the physiology, how to actually prescribe it, how to test it, and basically dispels all the bullshit that is out there around energy systems. But I'm going to do my best to relay some of that information right here. So they stuck NIRS devices, so near infrared spectroscopy. Essentially they're little devices that you put on the muscle, and it's going to read skeletal muscle oxygenation, or how much oxygen is going through that muscle, in a very simple way. And now they put this on the rectus femoris muscle, which is one of the quadricep muscles in professional boxers, had them do pad work, bad work, and sparring rounds, and they were not giving any specific instructions. So they were just doing what they usually do in training. So this graph here shows muscle oxygenation during sparring from the 1st to the 6th round. Now note the starting percentage of muscle oxygenation in both these graphs. You'll see that at the very beginning on the y-axis from graph E to graph F. The lower starting percentage from the 1st to the 6th round means these boxers are not recovering well enough to maximize performance, meaning they're starting each round further and further in an oxygen deficit. You can also see the increase in time delay, which is the little part at the beginning where the line kind of goes up before it goes down here, indicating impaired mitochondrial activation. There was also a reduction in fast resaturation rate, which is where the line quickly goes up at the end of the round, which is the muscle filling back up with oxygen, showing impaired muscle recovery. Now, why is this all important? Because VO2 max doesn't tell us this data. While VO2 max may be a general indicator of overall fitness, it doesn't tell us what's happening at the muscular level. And you can have an athlete with the low VO2 max that has a very good desaturation and resaturation rate as per graphs like this, and outperform someone with a high VO2 max that doesn't have this ability. And combat sports are full of instances like this that happen within the sport. And we can even look at other sports that might be similar as an example. So, for example, this study here by Dindorf and colleagues in 2023, they used NIRS on the forearms of sport climbers, and they found rapid oxygen desaturation during static holds and resaturation at rest, which would be kind of similar to grappling. For continuous exercise, we see oxygen desaturation in equilibrium, which is kind of the bottom part of that graph that sits where it starts to level out, where a lower skeletal muscle oxygenation percentage is maintained, which is actually similar to boxing, like in those graphs. And then finally, skeletal muscle oxygenation during a 1,000-meter kayak time trial is shown to be a better predictor of performance than VO2 max. Which then brings me all the way back into the conditioning modalities that you can use. One of them being sprint intervals. Yes, I've talked a lot about sprint intervals on this channel, and it's not the only way to do your conditioning. It's not the only thing you should do, but it is time efficient and it's going to target the adaptation that you need to improve your ability to recover between rounds and to stop you from gassing out. And it takes you 5 minutes. And sprint intervals have been shunned for way too long for being quote unquote too intense, with results being quote unquote too short term, and then quote unquote causing too much fatigue. None of those are true. Well, actually I can say they are too intense because they're damn intense, but that's not a problem. So Let's look at this paper, the second one by Usher and Babrai, where they show changes within the muscle when performing sprint intervals of 3 by 30 seconds on, 60 seconds off, twice a week for just 3 weeks. Now, I know the argument is, it's just 3 weeks. What do you do after that? It's just short term. Sprints will constantly change. You can do them year round. You will continually make progress. Just because the study is short term doesn't mean it's not being applied in the real world for long periods of time. So bear that in mind. Their testing protocol was an incremental run test to exhaustion with nares and intermittent occlusions after the run. So if you look at this graph here, increase in the area under the post-exhaustion skeletal muscle oxygenation curve, which I have circled there, suggests faster refill of oxygen availability of the muscle post-sprints that reflects a greater efficiency of oxygen use during recovery. Great, so now our muscles have become better at essentially recovering after hard efforts. Now, what about the muscle VO2 kinetics? Essentially how that line moves in that nares graph that I showed you before, or even in this graph. In Usher and Babrai's first study, which I showed you, they show across rounds, the time delay before skeletal muscle oxygenation starts extends, meaning potential impaired mitochondrial activation. We talked about it just before. We want mitochondria to work quickly to speed up these VO2 kinetics, which reduces oxygen debt and metabolic disturbance. And this study showed 3 weeks of sprint intervals significantly improved mitochondrial rate function, meaning it switched on faster. They also improved time to exhaustion, suggesting that central adaptations occurred at the heart level. Therefore, you can make crazy conditioning gains in such short periods of time because the intensity is so damn high, your body is forced to adapt. And that is one of the principles of training, is having enough stress to be able to signal and force the body to adapt to what is happening. It is one of the reasons that zone 2 isn't going to give you that, because for you to stress the body enough to force it to adapt, you have to run, bike, swim, whatever it is, longer than you did the previous weeks or more often. And when time is of the essence as a combat athlete, and also your energy, you don't want to be spending hours hitting the roads. And when you have a jam-packed technical training schedule, you have full-time work and you have a family life, probably not the best idea to take a low intensity approach. The second thing is, it's an inefficient way to trigger the PGC1A master switch for mitochondrial adaptations, as you typically need hours of it in one session to trigger these signaling pathways. Again, this master switch essentially is just the pathway that starts to signal the adaptations that we want more mitochondria and better functioning mitochondria. Thirdly, you're not efficiently targeting the endurance adaptations at the muscular level like I just showed you in these graphs, and you're not learning how to push hard and recover from those efforts. You can do as much low intensity work as you want, but if you're not spending time getting into these high heart rates and essentially practicing having that heart rate come back down in the recovery efforts, or at least stressing the body and forcing the body to have to recover fast enough during these efforts so you can go again, you're not going to get better at doing these efforts. It's almost like the principle of specificity applied into physiology. Now, if we go back into sprint intervals, and I'm going to cover some of the other high intensity interval training modalities in separate videos, but I think it's nice just to really reinforce this point on sprint interval training because it has been shunned so badly. And this is how you program them without any fancy equipment to be able to test it. Pick an equipment that allows high cadence and effort. Typically this would be an air bike, and by high cadence it's honestly like 110, 120 RPMs at max maybe. So you can use a spin bike too, but you have to really crank the resistance. A grinder also works, hill sprints if you have no access to none of those, and even shuttle runs. And by shuttle runs, it's usually something like 10-meter shuttle runs. Basically the change of direction is what increases the mechanical stress. So you want to have change of directions if you're going to do sprint intervals on flat ground. You're looking to do 6 to 30 seconds of work in your work interval, looking to accumulate 1 to 2 minutes of total work. Honestly, I would just stick with 1 minute of total work most of the time. You can get a lot done in that 1 minute. And you're typically looking at a 1:1 to 1:4 work to rest ratio. Now, typically in the past, I've recommended 1:2 to 1:8. That is better for, say, general population or more untrained individuals. As a fighter, you're probably training often, you're potentially competing, or you train to compete. You are not in the general population untrained realm. You probably have some form of conditioning under you. So 1:1 to 1:4, typically you're probably gonna sit in the 1:2, 1:3 area of work to rest when you're starting this. So 10 on 20 off, 30 on 60 off, 20 on 40 off, 10 on 30 off, etc. perform these directly after your strength training or your sparring or any kind of hard training. Ideally, you'd have one session that will be just like standalone, so where you're not as fatigued going into it. Now, just because you're fatigued doesn't mean they don't work. It's just about essentially setting off the metabolic cascade from that hard effort, and then you're just essentially maintaining it for that whole 1 minute of work. The effort will be relative to essentially that kind of day or where you are in your session there. So as long as it's max intensity for what you're trying to do or the current state you're in, you're going to be fine. Now, regardless of all this kind of conditioning information, if you're not doing your sport enough and you're not practicing your sport often with intent and mindfulness, none of this really matters. But if you are trying to maximize everything out of your training and you want to be able to spend more time on the mats and you still want to improve your conditioning, then taking an approach like this is going to help you, because it only takes you 5 minutes to do your conditioning 2 to 3 times a week. So while VO2 max is trending, it's a really cool thing for people to talk about and tell you to improve, to make sure you improve your combat sports performance, probably not that important in the grand scheme of things when you're trying to not gas out. Now, the other thing you don't want to worry about is this idea of lactic acid, which is actually lactate. So you should watch this video next, because I'm going to break down why you shouldn't fear the lactate monster, and instead you should embrace it as the molecule that is going to help you perform better as a fighter.